Atoms for Peace was delivered by President Dwight D. Eisenhower on December 8, 1953. Eisenhower was the commanding general in the Army. He started his career in the Army by going to West Point. After the Pearl Harbor attack, he'd be appointed the position of leading the Army in the Pacific War, and then he would help with NATO. From 1951 to 1963, he'd be President of the United States. As President, he served during the Cold War. This is when tensions were very tight between the USSR and the US. He introduced the idea of modern republicanism. This was trying to balance the budget while keeping the New Deal and Fair Deal ideas. He introduced his Atoms for Peace program, which is the lend of American uranium to nations that were developing. President Eisenhower gave his Atoms for Peace speech at the United Nations Assembly. The speech discussed the growing concern of the arms race between America and the Soviet Union. Eisenhower addressed the dangers that the nuclear weapons present to the world and the U.S. support against communism to help protect the world and democracy. Overall, Eisenhower expresses the hope for the world to be at peace. He also uses the speech to introduce his idea of using nuclear power to give aid to developing countries. The situation was the nuclear arms race, especially concerning the USSR and the US. As you can see, the United States possessed what might have been called a monopoly of atomic power, but that monopoly ceased to exist several years ago because the other nations were slowly gaining nuclear weapons. The occasion was December 8, 1953, at a United Nations Assembly. The audience was the United Nations, international leaders, and U.S. citizens. He had the privilege of addressing the General Assembly of the United Nations, and he primarily wanted to say this to the American people. His purpose was to show the U.S. support against communism, nuclear attacks, and the U.S. desire to help nuclear energy to developing countries. The government of the U.S. will remain steadfast in its support for this body, and the greatest destructive forces can be developed into a great boom for the benefit of all mankind. The second one is a really introduction of his Atoms for Peace program. The speaker is President Eisenhower, and he's speaking on behalf of the United States. As you can see in the example below, he is saying the American people share my belief. His tone is supportive and hopeful, yet he's slightly apprehensive. He says hope exists in the mind of one nation, but he also mentions the U.S. will be more than willing, and that's willing to support the other nations of the United Nations. And he realizes that there's still a danger shared by all because of this possession of nuclear weapons that the other countries have. His organization, he has very long sentences with multiple clauses, and he uses deductive reasoning. He starts out in the beginning talking about how the world is having all these nuclear problems and this nuclear arms race, to bringing it down to his ideas of having the Atoms for Peace program. The narrative, he is speaking in first person, as you can see in the example below. He's saying, I assure you, but it's also representative because you can also see in the example below, that the government of the United States will remain steadfast in the support. He uses diction that is really expressing fear, peace, and hope. He's talking about the fearful engines of the atomic power. He's hoping for a new avenue of peace, and he has hopes of men. He appeals with imagery to the presenting hope in the Cold War. He's talking about moving out of the dark chambers of horrors into the light. He uses a very formal tone. He kind of contains a lot of like paradoxes and analogies too, and his stories. So he talks about moving out of the dark chambers of horror to light. This is moving out of the Cold War into a new era he's kind of talking about, and he has paradoxes where he's talking about how the U.S. is having all this great military power, but he also mentions how this monopoly has ceased to exist. He's appealing to ethos by trying to present him as a strong, powerful leader, and also as the U.S. as a strong, powerful nation. He mentions his military profession, and he mentions how he was consulting with other leaders. He's appealing to pathos because he's appealing to the different sufferings that humans are facing. He's appealing to the fear that individuals face, and he's also appealing to hope that everyone has during this time. As you can see in the example below, he wants to move towards peace and happiness. He realizes that there's a fear of atomic military buildup, and he also mentions the suffering of people through famine, drought, and natural disaster. He appeals to logos by talking about how powerful these atomic bombs are truly, and talking about the beneficial uses of atomic power. His rhetorical strategies is he uses personifications. He's talking about deeds of peace, and he's saying how they speak louder than promises that people keep making. He uses Annapolis, which is the repetition of a word in the same way throughout a sentence structure. So here you have monopoly in the beginning of the sentence, and monopoly is repeated once again in the same part of the clause. He uses antithesis a lot too, because he'll talk about how there's danger in this world, as you can see here, but there's still hope, there's still idea that things will be better. He uses analogies once again with that moving out of the dark chambers of horror into the light. He uses anaphora, as you can see in the example below. He's using that repetition of the I know phrase. The importance is he's going to bring nuclear energy into the public domain. He's going to introduce the idea of using nuclear energy for positive results. So as the idea of using it for nuclear energy facilities to provide energy for others. And with this, he's going to start the Atoms for Peace program. This program is the lend of American uranium to other nations so they can use nuclear energy for positive results. And he's going to send it to Iran and other places in the Middle East. And he's going to really reveal the power of the United States military and show how strong we are in this speech by mentioning that the U.S. does have this backup supplies of everything. And also he's going to show the U.S. support against communism.